I was standing in the doorway of a cabin I had no legal right to enter, my hand still trembling on the rusted lock I had just broken with a crowbar I found in my husband's truck, and the smell that hit me first was lavender soap mixed with something I could not immediately identify, but that made every hair on my body stand straight up, because it was familiar in a way that should have been impossible. The cabin was supposed to be empty, abandoned, a mystery I was solving 3 weeks after burying my husband of 32 years. But what I saw when my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through decades of grime on those windows made my knees buckle so hard I had to grab the doorframe to stay upright, because sitting in a rocking chair in the corner of that single-room cabin, staring at me with eyes I would have recognized anywhere, even though I had not seen them in 17 years, was my daughter who died when she was 9 years old, my daughter whose funeral I attended, whose tiny casket I watched lowered into the ground, whose death certificate I kept in a folder in my office, because some part of me needed the proof that the worst day of my life actually happened. Except she was not 9 anymore. She was 26 years old, exactly the age she would have been if she had never died at all. And she was looking at me with an expression that was equal parts terror and something else I could not quite name. Something that looked almost like relief, and the only words that came out of my mouth in that moment were not a question or an exclamation, but a statement of fact that my brain somehow managed to process before my heart could catch up. I said, and I will never forget how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was shattering into pieces smaller than atoms. You are alive. You have been alive this whole time, and your father knew. He knew, and he kept you here, and he let me believe you were dead for 17 years, and now he is gone and cannot explain any of this. And you and I are going to have to figure out together what kind of man could do something like this, and why I never saw it coming, even though I shared a bed with him for 3 decades. But what neither my dead husband nor my supposedly dead daughter could have anticipated in their years of this secret arrangement was that I had been preparing for something, though I did not know what, ever since I found the cabin key hidden in a false bottom of his tackle box 2 days after his funeral, a tackle box he told me never to touch because it contained his most precious fishing lures from his grandfather, and like the obedient wife I had been trained to be for 32 years, I had never once opened it until he was no longer around to stop me. And what I did in the weeks and months after that discovery, the investigation I conducted, the truths I uncovered, the justice I served not just for myself, but for my daughter who had been imprisoned in that cabin for 17 years of her life, did not just destroy the perfect memory everyone had of my devoted husband. It destroyed the entire foundation of lies that my marriage was built on. It exposed a conspiracy that involved more people than just him, and it gave my daughter and me something we both thought we had lost forever, which was a future together and a chance to reclaim every single year that was stolen from us. And I am going to tell you exactly how I did it. How I went from a grieving widow who thought she had lost everything to a woman who discovered she had been living in a prison of lies and decided to burn that prison to the ground with everyone who helped build it still inside. Before I tell you exactly how I unraveled 17 years of deception and made every single person who participated in this nightmare pay for what they did to me and my child, if you love stories of women who refuse to accept the reality they are handed, who dig until they find the truth no matter how buried it is, who turn their worst nightmare into their greatest source of power, subscribe right now and turn on all notifications, because what I discovered and what I did next will shake you to your core and restore your faith that some wrongs can be made right even when they have been hidden for nearly 2 decades. This channel is dedicated to stories of women who were told to move on, to heal, to accept, and who said absolutely not. I will find the truth first. And I guarantee you will want to see what happens next in my story, and in the dozens of other stories of mothers, wives, and daughters who refuse to be silenced that I share here every single week. Hit subscribe and the notification bell right now, because what comes next in my story is just the beginning of how far a mother will go when she finally understands the magnitude of what was taken from her. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the life I thought I had before that cabin door opened and revealed that everything I believed about my existence existence was a carefully constructed lie. My name is Catherine. I am 53 years old now, though I feel about 1,000 years older than that after everything I have learned. And for 32 years, I was married to a man named Robert, who everyone in our town of Millbrook considered to be a model husband, father, and community member. Robert was a civil engineer, well-respected, well-liked, the kind of man who coached Little League even after our daughter died, who volunteered at the church, who never missed a day of work in 30 years at the same firm, who kissed me goodbye every morning and told me he loved me every night, who seemed to grieve our daughter's death with the same bottomless pain I felt every single day for 17 years. We met when I was 21, and he was 24. I was finishing my degree in library science, and he was already establishing himself in his career, and he pursued me with a focus and intensity that I found flattering at the time, but that I now understand was the first red flag I should have seen, but was too young and naive to recognize. He was obsessed with the idea of family, of creating the perfect domestic life, of having a daughter specifically, not just a child, but a daughter, and he talked about it constantly during our courtship in a way that should have seemed strange, but that I interpreted as sweet, because I was 21 years old and did not yet understand that when someone is that specific about their vision for your future together, they are not dreaming with you, they are casting you in a role you did not audition for. We married within a year. I got pregnant within 6 months of the wedding, and I remember how his face looked when the ultrasound technician told us we were having a girl. A look of satisfaction so profound it was almost unsettling, like he had willed this specific outcome into existence through sheer force of desire. Our daughter Emma was born on a Tuesday in April, and from the moment she entered the world, Robert was obsessed with her in a way that went beyond normal paternal love into something I did not have words for at the time, something that made me vaguely uncomfortable on occasions I did not allow myself to examine too closely because I was busy being grateful I had married a man who was so involved with his child when so many of my friends complained their husbands barely looked up from the television during feedings. He insisted on doing bath time every single night. He was the one who got up with her when she had nightmares. He took her on special weekend trips starting when she was just 5 years old, just the two of them. Trips he said were important for father-daughter bonding, and I stayed home and told myself I was lucky to have such a devoted husband and father, even though some part of me, some part I shoved down so deep I almost convinced myself it did not exist, wondered why he never wanted me to come along, why those trips were always to places with no cell phone service, why Emma always came back quiet and clingy in a way she had not been before leaving. I sacrificed everything I had been building for myself to support Robert's career and our family life. I had been offered a position as assistant director at the county library system, a position I had worked toward for years, a position that would have meant autonomy and financial independence and a professional identity separate from wife and mother. But Robert convinced me, and it did not take much convincing because I had been raised to believe that family came first always, that Emma needed me home, that his career required a wife who could be flexible, who could host dinners for clients, who could manage all the domestic details so he could focus on providing for us. And I said yes because that is what women of my generation were taught to do. We said yes, and we sacrificed, and we made ourselves smaller, and we called it love. I gave up that job. I gave up my professional ambitions. I gave up the version of myself who had wanted something beyond the domestic sphere, and I poured everything I had into being the perfect wife and the perfect mother and maintaining the perfect home. And for years I told myself I was happy. I was fulfilled. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, even as some small voice inside me grew quieter and quieter until I could barely hear it anymore. And then Emma died. At least that is what I was told. That is what I believed with every cell of my body for 17 years. She was 9 years old, it was summer, and Robert had taken her on one of their special weekend trips, this one to a cabin he said he had rented near a lake about 3 hours north of Millbrook, a place he said would be perfect for teaching Emma to fish and hike, skills he believed were important for her development as a well-rounded person. I stayed home because I was in the middle of organizing the church fundraiser, a role I had volunteered for because I needed something to fill the hours that stretched empty and purposeless when Emma was at school and Robert was at work, something that made me feel useful even though I was not being paid, something that gave me an identity beyond wife and mother, even though that identity was still defined entirely by service to others. They left Friday afternoon, they were supposed to return Sunday evening, and when Sunday evening came and went with no phone call, no text message, no word at all, I started to worry in that way mothers worry when they know something is wrong, even though they cannot articulate what or why. By Monday morning, I was frantic. I was calling Robert's phone every 5 minutes. I was calling the sheriff's office. I was calling everyone I could think of. And finally, at 2 in the afternoon, a state trooper showed up at my door with an expression that told me everything I needed to know before he said a single word. There had been an accident, he told me, his voice professionally sympathetic in that way that people use when they are delivering the worst news of your life, but need to maintain emotional distance to do their job. Robert's truck had gone off a mountain road during a storm Saturday night, the trooper explained. It had rolled down an embankment. Emma had been killed instantly, crushed by the impact, and Robert had been thrown from the vehicle and was in critical condition at a hospital 3 hours away, unconscious, not expected to survive the night. Though he ultimately did survive, he woke up 3 days later with a severe traumatic brain injury that affected his memory and cognitive function in ways the doctor said were permanent. I remember the sound that came out of me when the trooper said Emma was dead. It was not a scream or a cry, but something animal and primal, something that did not sound human, and I remember collapsing on my kitchen floor. That cold linoleum floor where I had made thousands of meals, where I had cleaned up thousands of spills, where I had lived my small domestic life, and I remember thinking with perfect clarity that I would never be okay again, that some essential part of me had died with my daughter, that I would spend the rest of my life walking through the world as a ghost of the woman I used to be. They would not let me see her body. They said it was too damaged. They said I should remember her the way she was, and I was in such profound shock that I accepted this without question. I signed papers. I made arrangements. I planned a funeral for my 9-year-old daughter while my husband lay unconscious in a hospital bed, and I buried an empty casket because that is what they told me to do. That is what everyone said was for the best, and I was too destroyed to question it or demand answers, or insist on anything because I could barely function enough to breathe in and out. Robert came home 6 weeks later. He was physically recovered, but mentally he was different. The doctors said the brain injury had affected his personality, his memory, his cognitive processing. He was quieter, more withdrawn. Sometimes he would stare into space for hours. Sometimes he would say things that did not make sense, and I took care of him the way I had taken care of Emma and taken care of our home. I added nursing him through his recovery to my long list of invisible unpaid labor, and I never questioned it, because what else was I supposed to do? Where else was I supposed to go? Who else did I have in the world after losing my daughter? For 17 years I lived in a fog of grief so thick I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. I went through the motions of living. I took care of Robert, who recovered enough to return to work part-time but who was never quite the same, who sometimes would disappear for hours or even full days, and when I asked where he had been, he would say he did not remember, or he would become agitated and defensive in a way that the doctors said was normal for brain injury patients, so I stopped asking. I volunteered at the church. I organized fundraisers. I visited the cemetery where my daughter's empty casket was buried every single Sunday without fail. I put fresh flowers on her grave. I talked to her. I told her about my week. I cried into the grass above where I believed her body was resting, and I constructed an entire life around the hole she had left behind. I never remarried. I never dated. I never even considered it because how could I when the love of my life, my daughter, my reason for existing, was dead and buried, and I was just waiting to die myself so I could be with her again. I pushed away friends who tried to help. I declined invitations. I made myself smaller and smaller until I was barely visible, until I was a ghost haunting my own life. And Robert seemed content with this arrangement. He never pushed me to move on or date or do anything except continue maintaining our home and taking care of him and showing up to the volunteer commitments I had made, because those commitments were the only thing that gave my life any structure or meaning. And then Robert died 3 weeks before I found that cabin. He died of a heart attack at age 60. Sudden and unexpected. He was at work. He collapsed at his desk. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. and I felt nothing when I got the phone call. Absolutely nothing, which should have told me something about the state of my inner life, but I was too numb to analyze it. I planned his funeral the way I had planned Emma's 17 years earlier. I went through the motions. I accepted condolences from colleagues and neighbors and church members who all said what a good man he was, what a devoted husband, what a tragic life we had lived losing our daughter and now him. And I smiled and nodded and said thank you and felt absolutely hollow inside. Because I had been hollow for so long, I did not remember what it felt like to be full. After the funeral, I started going through his belongings because that is what widows do. We sort and organize and decide what to keep and what to donate and what to throw away. And that is when I found the tackle box, the one he said contained his grandfather's precious lures, the one he had told me never to touch. And without him there to stop me, I opened it. Inside, there were no fishing lures at all. There were keys, dozens of keys on rings and labeled with tags, and most of them I could identify. Keys to our house, keys to his office, keys to our storage unit. But there was one key that did not make sense. A single silver key on a plain ring with a tag that said only coordinates, latitude and longitude numbers written in Robert's distinctive handwriting. And I stared at that key for probably 20 minutes before I made the decision that would change everything. I went to my computer, I typed those coordinates into a mapping website, and I watched as the map zoomed in on a location about 3 hours north of Millbrook, in the mountains, in the middle of nowhere, at the end of a dirt road that barely showed up on the satellite view. And I knew with absolute certainty that I had never been to this place, that Robert had never mentioned owning property there, that this was a secret he had kept from me for reasons I could not fathom, but that I knew I needed to understand. I printed the directions, I got in my car the next morning before I could talk myself out of it, and I drove 3 hours north with that key in my pocket and a growing sense of dread in my stomach that I could not explain or rationalize or dismiss. The cabin was exactly where the coordinates said it would be, at the end of a rutted dirt road that my sedan barely managed to navigate, surrounded by dense forest, isolated in a way that seemed intentional, hidden in a way that suggested purpose. It was small, maybe 400 square feet, one room with a single window on each wall, a metal roof streaked with rust, a door with a lock that matched the key in my pocket, and I sat in my car for 10 minutes staring at that cabin and trying to convince myself to turn around and go home, to leave this mystery alone, to accept that Robert had secrets, and some secrets die with the people who keep them. But I could not do it. I could not drive away, because something was pulling me toward that door, with a force I could not resist. Some instinct I had learned to ignore over decades of being a good, obedient wife who did not question or investigate or demand answers, and I realized sitting there that I was tired of being that woman. I was tired of not knowing. I was tired of living in a fog. I was tired of being half dead myself. I got out of the car. I walked to the door. I put the key in the lock, and it would not turn. The lock was frozen or rusted or broken. I tried for 5 minutes to make it work, and finally I went back to Robert's truck, which I had been driving since his death because my sedan was old and unreliable, and I found a crowbar in the back. And I made a decision in that moment that felt like the first real decision I had made in 17 years. I was going to break into this cabin. I was going to see what Robert had been hiding. I was going to take back some small measure of agency in a life that had been entirely controlled by circumstance and tragedy and other people's choices, and if there were legal consequences, I would deal with them because at 53 years old with nothing and no one left to live for, I genuinely did not care anymore about following rules that had never protected me from anything. I forced the lock, it broke easier than I expected, and I pushed the door open, and that is when I smelled the lavender soap, and that is when I saw her, my daughter, my Emma, alive and 26 years old, and staring at me from that rocking chair, with an expression I will see in my nightmares and my dreams for the rest of my life. For a full minute, neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. We just stared at each other across that small room, and I watched as her expression changed from terror to confusion to recognition to something that looked like hope, but also like fear, and finally she spoke first. Her voice rough like she did not use it often, and she said, "Mom, you found me. I knew you would eventually. I knew he could not keep me hidden forever. I knew you would come." The next several hours are a blur in my memory. I remember sobbing so hard I thought I would vomit. I remember Emma crying too, but also pulling away when I tried to hug her. I remember looking around that cabin and seeing how she had been living, a narrow bed in one corner, a a small kitchenette with a propane stove and a mini fridge, a chemical toilet behind a curtain, shelves full of books and craft supplies and everything a person would need to survive, but nothing a person would need to truly live. And I remember the rage that started building in my chest, hot and sharp and all-consuming, as I began to understand what Robert had done. He had not lost our daughter in an accident. He had taken her, he had faked her death, he had kept her in this cabin for 17 years. He had visited her weekly, sometimes more, bringing supplies and food and checking on her, and living a double life where he was the grieving father in Millbrook and the captor here in these mountains, and he had let me believe she was dead. He had watched me grieve. He had watched me put flowers on an empty grave every Sunday for 17 years. He had watched me become a ghost of myself, and he had never once shown a flicker of guilt or remorse or humanity. Emma told me everything over those first few hours, and every word that came out of her mouth was another knife wound in my chest, another layer of betrayal I had to process, another piece of the puzzle that made the picture of Robert's monstrosity more complete and more incomprehensible. She told me how on that trip when she was 9 he had driven to this cabin instead of the lake he had promised, how the drive took hours, and she fell asleep in the back seat with her favorite stuffed elephant clutched in her arms, how when she woke up they were on a dirt road she did not recognize, and she asked where the lake was, and he said it was just a little further. She told me how when they arrived at the cabin he carried their bags inside and told her this was going to be their special place, their secret place, somewhere just for the two of them, and how exciting that sounded to a 9-year-old girl who loved her father and trusted him completely and did not yet understand that special and secret can be code words for trapped and isolated. She told me how the first day was almost normal. They explored the woods around the cabin, they cooked hot dogs on a camping stove, they played card games, and she kept asking when they were going to the lake, and he kept saying tomorrow, we will go tomorrow. She told me how on the second day, when she said she wanted to go home because she missed me, and missed her own bed, and missed her toys, he sat her down on the narrow bed in that cabin and explained with tears running down his face that there had been an accident, that I had been hurt very badly, that I was in the hospital, and the doctor said I might not make it, and that she needed to stay here where it was safe and quiet while he took care of everything. She told me she cried for hours. She said she wanted to see me. She said she wanted to go to the hospital, and he said she could not. Children were not allowed in intensive care units. She had to wait here and be brave, and he would come back as soon as he could with news. She told me how days turned into weeks, and he kept coming back with updates that made no sense, that I was getting better, but then I was getting worse, that I was asking for her, but then the doctors said visits would be too upsetting, that she needed to be patient and trust him and stay in the cabin because the world outside was dangerous and confusing and she was safe here. She told me how she tried to leave in those early weeks, how she would wait until he was gone, and then try the door only to find it locked from the outside, how she tried the windows only to find them nailed shut, how she screamed and cried and pounded on the walls, but there was no one to hear her, no neighbors, no passing cars, just endless forest and silence. She told me about the first time she really tried to escape. She must have been 10 or maybe 11. She had managed to break a window pane and squeeze through the opening, cutting her arms on the glass, leaving blood on the window frame, and she ran into the forest with no shoes and no coat and no idea which direction to go. She told me she ran for hours until her feet were bleeding, and she was so cold she could not feel her fingers, and she finally collapsed under a tree and fell asleep, or maybe passed out, and when she woke up, it was dark, and Robert was standing over her with a flashlight and an expression she had never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more frightening, something that looked like disappointment mixed with determination. He carried her back to the cabin. He cleaned her wounds. He gave her warm food and dry clothes, and then he installed bars on all the windows and additional locks on the door. And he explained very calmly and very clearly that if she ever tried that again, he would have to take more serious measures to keep her safe, measures that would be unpleasant for both of them, but that he would do because he loved her and could not let her hurt herself. She told me how over the years the story changed, how eventually he stopped pretending I was in the hospital and started saying I had died, that the grief had been too much, and I had died of a broken heart because I thought she was dead too. And this news devastated her in ways I cannot imagine because she thought not only was she trapped, but that her mother had died believing she was gone. She told me how he eventually admitted years later, when she was maybe 15 or 16 and had stopped trying to escape because she had learned it was futile, that I was not actually dead, that he had lied about that too, but that I was sick in a different way. I was mentally unstable. I had become obsessed with her death. I spent all my time at the cemetery. I would not be able to handle knowing she was alive. The shock would kill me or drive me completely insane. And so this arrangement, where she stayed hidden, was the kindest thing for everyone involved. She told me how he brought her books, hundreds of books over the years, how she read everything he brought her because there was nothing else to do, how she taught herself advanced mathematics and science and literature because the textbooks he brought were years below her actual intelligence level, and she needed something to occupy her mind, or she thought she would go crazy from the isolation. She told me how he brought her art supplies and craft materials, and she spent years drawing and painting and creating things just to have something to do with her hands, just to feel like she was making something in a life where everything was about captivity and control and endless sameness. She told me about the routines she created to maintain her sanity, how she would exercise every morning doing jumping jacks and sit-ups in the tiny space, how she would practice her handwriting for hours, how she would have elaborate conversations with imaginary friends because she had no one else to talk to except Robert during his weekly visits. She told me about those visits, how they became the structure around which her entire existence revolved, how she would count the days between them, how she would prepare questions to ask him about the outside world, how she craved information about what was happening beyond the cabin walls, even though every piece of information just reinforced how much she was missing, how trapped she was, how the world was moving forward without her. She told me how he would bring her news magazines and newspapers, but they would be weeks or months old, carefully selected to not have dates that would let her pinpoint exactly when they were from, how this was another way he controlled her sense of time and reality. She told me how he would bring her clothes as she grew, how he somehow always knew her size, how she realized years later he must have been keeping detailed records of her growth and development, like she was an experiment or a project, rather than his daughter. She told me about the psychological tactics he used to maintain control, how he would praise her for being good and cooperative and threaten to withdraw visits or reduce food supplies if she was difficult, how he created a system where her basic survival depended on pleasing him and not asking too many questions and accepting the reality he constructed for her. She told me how he convinced her over the years that she could not leave even if the door was unlocked, that she had no identity in the outside world, that everyone thought she was dead, that if she showed up anywhere claiming to be Emma Chen who died in a car accident 17 years ago, she would be arrested or institutionalized, that no one would believe her, and she would end up in a psychiatric facility, which would be worse than the cabin, because at least here she had books and art supplies, and relative freedom within the four walls. She told me how she started planning a different kind of escape in her late teens, not a physical escape, but an emotional one, how she started dissociating during his visits, how she would mentally leave her body and imagine she was somewhere else, someone else, how she created elaborate fantasy worlds in her mind where she was free and had friends and went to school and lived a normal life. She told me how she struggled with suicidal thoughts, especially in her early 20s, when the weight of knowing she would probably spend her entire life in this cabin became unbearable. How she would stand in front of the small mirror Robert had mounted on the wall and barely recognize the young woman staring back at her because she still felt 9 years old inside, frozen at the age when her life stopped. She told me the only thing that kept her alive during those darkest times was a stubborn hope she could not quite kill, a belief that somehow someday someone would find her, that this could not be her entire life, that the universe was not so cruel as to let her rot in this cabin forever, without anyone ever knowing what happened to her. I need to pause here and ask you something from my heart to yours, woman to woman, mother to mother, human to human. Have you ever had the foundation of your entire reality shattered in a single moment? Have you ever discovered that the life you thought you were living was a complete fabrication? That the person you trusted most in the world was a monster? That everything you believed about your history and your identity was a lie? Have you ever felt the specific kind of rage that comes not from a single betrayal, but from the realization that you were betrayed every single day for years, for decades, that you, Were manipulated so thoroughly you did not even know manipulation was happening? If right now you are feeling that burning mix of horror and fury and profound sadness because you are imagining what it would be like to discover your child was alive after grieving them for 17 years, if you are thinking about all the years that were stolen that can never be returned, if you are processing the magnitude of the deception and control that would be required to maintain this lie, I want you to do something powerful for yourself and for every other mother who has been lied to and manipulated and gaslit right now. Write in the comments, "I trust my instincts from now on." Just those 6 words. This is not just a comment on a YouTube video. This is your declaration to yourself that you will never again ignore that small voice inside that tells you something is wrong, that you will never again let someone convince you that your perception of reality is incorrect when you know in your bones that something is off, that you will never again be so well trained in obedience and agreeableness that you sacrifice your own knowing on the altar of keeping the peace. And when you write it, you are not just helping yourself, you are helping every other woman scrolling through here who has been told she is crazy or paranoid or dramatic when she questions things that do not add up, who desperately needs permission to trust herself more than she trusts the people who lie to her face. Write it now. I trust my instincts from now on. Thank you for trusting me with that declaration. Now let me show you what happened when I finally started trusting my own instincts after 17 years of living in a fog of manufactured grief. The first thing I did after Emma and I stopped crying, and I had heard enough of her story to understand the basics of what Robert had done, was I took her out of that cabin. I did not ask permission. I did not worry about whether she was legally allowed to leave. I did not care about any of the logistical or legal complications that I knew were coming. I just put her in my car, and I drove her back to Millbrook, and I took her to my house, our house, the house she had lived in until she was 9 years old, and I watched as she walked through rooms she barely remembered and touched things that used to be hers. A stuffed elephant on a shelf in what used to be her bedroom, photographs on the wall of a family that had not existed in 17 years, evidence of a life that had been stolen from both of us. And then I did something that probably seems obvious, but that took me 2 full days to work up the courage to do. I called the police. The detective who took my statement, a woman in her 40s named Sarah Reeves, who I would later learn had a daughter Emma's age, looked at me like I was insane when I first started talking. She thought I was a grieving widow who had had some kind of psychotic break, who had found some young woman who resembled my dead daughter, and had convinced myself, and possibly her, that she was Emma. And I could see the pity and concern in Detective Reeves' eyes as she took notes and asked gentle questions clearly designed to assess my mental stability. But then she asked to speak to Emma alone, and whatever Emma told her in that conversation changed everything, because when Detective Reeves came back into the room where I was waiting, her expression was no longer pitying, it was grim and determined and angry in a way that told me she believed us. She said they would need to run DNA tests to confirm Emma's identity. They would need to investigate the accident from 17 years ago. They would need to exhume the casket that was buried in Millbrook Cemetery to determine what, if anything, was inside it. And she said all of this would take time, weeks or possibly months, but that if our story was true, if Robert had really done what we were claiming, then this was one of the most elaborate and disturbing crimes she had encountered in 20 years of law enforcement. The DNA test came back in 3 days and confirmed what I already knew with absolute certainty. Emma was my biological daughter. She was alive. She was exactly who she said she was. And suddenly, our story went from a delusional widow's fantasy to a criminal investigation of the highest priority. They exhumed the casket. It was empty except for some weighted objects to make it feel like a body during the funeral, and the state police launched a full investigation into how Robert had managed to fake Emma's death and get away with it for 17 years. What they discovered in the weeks that followed was a conspiracy that went beyond just Robert, that involved at least 3 other people who had helped him stage the accident and create the false documentation and maintain the lie. People I had trusted, people I had considered friends, people who had consoled me at Emma's funeral and hugged me in the church parking lot and told me time would heal my pain, while they knew the entire time that my daughter was alive and imprisoned 3 hours away. The medical examiner who had signed Emma's death certificate without ever seeing a body, a man named Dr. Richard Chen, who had been Robert's friend since college, had falsified the entire report. The state trooper who had come to my door to tell me Emma was dead, a man named Officer James Morrison, who I had baked cookies for and invited to holiday gatherings because he seemed like such a kind person, who had delivered such terrible news with such compassion, had been paid by Robert to deliver the fake news and make it official. The funeral director, a woman named Patricia Halloway, who I had known for years through church, had conducted a funeral with an empty casket and had never said a word, had accepted payment to participate in this deception, and had watched me sob over my daughter's grave every Sunday for 17 years without ever telling me the truth. All of them had been paid. All of them had their reasons, money or blackmail or both, and all of them had conspired to help Robert imprison our daughter and psychologically torture me for nearly 2 decades. But what they did not know, what they could not have anticipated, is that the fog I had been living in for 17 years lifted the moment I found Emma, and what emerged from that fog was not the grieving, obedient widow they had all gotten so comfortable around. It was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, and a rage so pure and focused, it was almost holy. I started my own investigation parallel to the police investigation. I started connecting dots they had not thought to connect yet, and I started realizing that Robert's ability to pull this off, to maintain this double life, to visit that cabin every week for 17 years without anyone noticing or questioning, meant he had help beyond just the 3 co-conspirators the police had identified. I started thinking about all the times he had disappeared for hours or days, and claimed his brain injury made him forget where he had been. I started thinking about the camping trips and fishing trips and business trips that now seemed suspicious. I started looking at our financial records with new eyes, and I started finding irregularities. There were regular cash withdrawals every month for 17 years. I found them going back to the month after Emma's supposed death, always exactly $450, always on the first Friday of the month, amounts too large to be for routine expenses, but not large enough to trigger any fraud alerts or tax audits. I sat at my kitchen table with 17 years of bank statements spread out in front of me, statements I had never looked at carefully before because Robert handled all our finances, and I trusted him completely, and I used a highlighter to mark every single one of those withdrawals, creating a visual timeline of deception that made me feel physically sick. $450 times 12 months times 17 years equals $91,800 in cash that disappeared from our accounts with no explanation. Money that I now understood had been used to stock that cabin with food and supplies and keep my daughter imprisoned. There were credit card charges at a grocery store called Mountain View Market in a town called Pine Ridge that I had never heard of, charges that appeared like clockwork every Wednesday for 17 years, charges for amounts that ranged from $75 to $150. And when I looked up Pine Ridge, I discovered it was the closest town to the cabin, about 15 miles away, a tiny place with barely 1,000 residents. I calculated that over 17 years, Robert had spent approximately $100,000 at that grocery store, buying food and supplies for the daughter he had stolen. And I had never noticed these charges because I was not the one who reviewed the credit card statements. Robert always did that. He always paid the bills. He always handled the money. And I had never questioned it because that was his domain. And I trusted him completely. And that trust was the weapon he used to keep me in the dark. There were payments to a property management company called Summit Rentals LLC, payments of $600 per month going back 17 years, payments that appeared on a credit card I did not even know we had, a card that was in Robert's name only, and that he must have kept completely separate from our joint accounts. I found this card only because I was going through a box of papers from his office at work, papers the company had boxed up and sent to me after his death, papers I almost threw away without looking through, and buried in the middle of routine work documents was a single credit card statement from this secret account. I called Summit Rentals LLC. I lied and said I was Robert's widow handling his estate, and I needed information about the property he had been renting, and the woman on the phone, bored and unsuspicious, told me it was a cabin in Pine Ridge, gave me the address, told me the rent was paid through the end of the current month, and did I want to terminate the lease or continue it? I said I would continue it. I did not want them going to clean out the cabin before I could get there, before I could see what secrets Robert had been keeping in a place he had rented under a false name, Stephen Morrison, which I later realized was a combination of his middle name and the last name of the police officer who had helped him fake Emma's death. Every piece of financial evidence I uncovered, I documented meticulously with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that only comes from years of being told I was not smart enough to handle money or understand complicated things, years of being kept deliberately ignorant of my own financial life, and now I was using that suppressed intelligence to dismantle Robert's lies piece by piece. I photographed bank statements with my phone, I downloaded credit card records as PDFs, and saved them in multiple locations, including cloud storage, because I was terrified something would happen to this evidence. I created spreadsheets tracking every suspicious transaction with dates and amounts and locations. I built timelines and charts and graphs that made the patterns impossible to ignore. I found receipts he had kept in a folder in his office at work, receipts from Mountain View Market itemizing his purchases, and I read through them with growing horror as I realized he had been buying things like children's vitamins and feminine hygiene products and specific foods I knew Emma loved as a child. He had been provisioning her imprisonment with the same careful attention to detail he brought to every project in his work life, treating her captivity as just another task to be managed efficiently. I handed all of this evidence to Detective Reeves in a meeting that lasted 4 hours. I walked her through every document, every transaction, every piece of the financial puzzle, and I watched her face grow grimmer and more determined as she realized the level of premeditation and planning this crime had required. She looked at me across the conference table in the police station, this woman who I had initially thought was pitying me as a delusional widow, and she said with something like admiration in her voice that most people do not have the clarity or focus to do this kind of forensic work in the middle of trauma this profound, that most people in my situation would be falling apart, or sedated, or unable to function, and she asked me how I was holding it together. I told her the truth. I said I was holding it together because falling apart was a luxury I could not afford right now, because Emma needed me to be strong and clear and focused, because justice required documentation and evidence, and someone had to do the work of building the case, and that someone was going to be me, because I had 17 years of rage to fuel me and a daughter to protect, and absolutely nothing left to lose. I also started talking to people in Millbrook systematically and strategically, people who had known Robert, people who had worked with him, people who had volunteered alongside him at church and community events, and I asked questions that were designed to seem like casual, grief-stricken widow curiosity, but that were actually very strategic and very targeted, questions about his habits, his schedule, his relationships, his behavior over the past 17 years, questions I had never thought to ask before because I had no reason to question the narrative of my own life. And I started hearing things that made the picture clearer, details that individually meant nothing, but that together created a pattern that was damning. People mentioned how Robert was always the first to volunteer for supply runs during church events or community fundraisers, how he would take the list and disappear for 3 or 4 hours and come back with everything needed plus a little extra. How he was so reliable about this that eventually people stopped offering to help or go with him because Robert had it handled. Robert always had everything under control. I realize now those supply runs were covers for his trips to the cabin. He would drive the 3 hours there, spend 30 minutes or an hour with Emma, drive 3 hours back, and claim the shopping had taken all day because he had to go to multiple stores to find specific items. No one questioned it because Robert was trustworthy, dependable, the kind of man who did what he said he would do, and it never occurred to anyone, including me, that he was using our trust as camouflage for his crimes. People mentioned how Robert had a Wednesday routine that was sacred. He would leave work at exactly 3 p.m. every Wednesday, never scheduled meetings after 2 p.m. on Wednesdays, would get agitated and defensive if anyone tried to book something in that time slot, and everyone at his firm knew Wednesday afternoons were Robert's personal time, and they respected it because Robert never took vacation days, never called in sick, was always available every other time, so if he needed Wednesday afternoons, that seemed reasonable. I realized those Wednesday afternoons were his weekly visits to Emma. He would drive to Pine Ridge, spend time with her, drive back, and be home by 8 or 9 p.m. And when I asked him where he had been, he would say he had been driving to clear his head, that the brain injury made him need solitude sometimes. that driving helped him think, and I believed him because the doctors had said brain injury patients often developed odd coping mechanisms and needed patience and understanding. People mentioned how Robert had been obsessed with keeping Emma's room exactly as it was when she died, how he had told me it was a shrine to her memory, and I had accepted that as a reasonable expression of grief, but multiple people told me they had seen him spending hours in that room with the door closed, hours where he would not respond if I knocked, hours where afterwards he would emerge looking drained and distant. I started wondering what he was really doing in there, whether he was planning his next visit to the cabin, whether he was maintaining some sick fantasy in his mind about being the perfect father to the daughter he had imprisoned, whether he was rehearsing the lies he would tell her about why I could not come see her, why she had to stay hidden, why this captivity was somehow for her own good. I went into Emma's room after these realizations, this room that had been frozen in time for 17 years, and I looked at it with new eyes and saw it for what it was. Not a shrine, but a stage set, a prop in Robert's elaborate performance of grief, and I felt such rage I had to leave the room before I destroyed everything in it. People mentioned small things that now seemed significant, how Robert always paid in cash when he was out with colleagues or friends, how he never used credit cards in social situations, how he always had a thick wallet full of bills which people joked about because who carries that much cash anymore. I realized he was hiding his spending patterns, making sure there were no credit card records of him buying drinks or dinner in Pine Ridge or nearby towns on his Wednesday trips, making sure his financial trail stayed as clean as possible. People mentioned how Robert would sometimes seem distracted or distant during conversations, how he would get a faraway look in his eyes and they assumed he was thinking about Emma, grieving his lost daughter, but I wondered now if he was thinking about his imprisoned daughter, calculating when he needed to bring more supplies, worrying about whether she was okay alone in that cabin, managing the logistics of his double life. People mentioned how Robert never wanted to travel, how I had suggested over the years that we take trips together, vacations, weekend getaways to help us heal from Emma's death, and he always had excuses. Work was too busy, he was too tired, travel stressed him out with his brain injury, maybe next year, maybe someday, but not now. I realized he could not travel because he had to maintain his weekly visits to Emma. He could not risk being gone for more than a few days because she depended on him for food and supplies, and he had constructed a prison that required constant maintenance. His whole life was structured around hiding his crime and maintaining his dual role as grieving father in Millbrook and captor father in Pine Ridge. And every choice he made, every excuse he gave, every routine he established was in service of keeping those two worlds separate and keeping me blind to what was happening 3 hours away. The more I dug, the more I found, and the more I found, the colder and more calculated I became. I was not crying anymore. I was not falling apart. I was not the broken, grieving woman everyone expected me to be. I was focused and clear and absolutely determined to make sure every single person who had participated in this nightmare faced consequences that matched the magnitude of their crimes. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Angela Martinez, who specialized in cases involving parental abduction and who was personally outraged by what had been done to Emma and me. And together we started building not just a criminal case, but a civil case against everyone involved. We were going to make sure they lost everything, their money, their reputations, their freedom, everything. And I was going to watch it happen with a satisfaction that some people might call unhealthy, but that I called justice. I made a phone call one afternoon about 6 weeks after finding Emma, a phone call to a journalist I had known slightly years ago when I was still working at the library before Emma was born, before I sacrificed my career for family, a woman named Rebecca Stone, who I remembered as being sharp and tenacious and unafraid of powerful people, who now worked as an investigative reporter for a major national newspaper. I looked her up online. I found her email. I sent her a message with a subject line that said, "I have a story that will make your career and change how people think about parental abduction," and I waited. She called me within an hour, her voice cautious but interested, clearly thinking this might be a crank or a delusional person but willing to listen. And I spent 45 minutes on the phone with her laying out everything. The fake death, the 17 years of imprisonment, the conspiracy involving a doctor and a police officer and a funeral director, the husband who maintained this deception until his death, the financial records I had uncovered, the cabin where my daughter had been kept, all of it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when I finished talking, and then Rebecca said in a voice that was shaking slightly, "I need to verify everything you are telling me. I need to see documents. I need to interview your daughter if she is willing. I need to talk to the police. But if this is true, if even half of this is true, this is one of the most disturbing cases I have ever encountered, and I will dedicate whatever time and resources are necessary to tell this story the right way. I told her I would give her complete access. I would provide every document I had. I would allow her to interview Emma with appropriate therapeutic support present. I would cooperate fully with fact-checking and verification. Because I wanted this story told nationally, I wanted everyone to know what Robert had done. I wanted his name destroyed. I wanted no one to ever remember him as the devoted father and husband and community member they all thought he was. I wanted them to remember him as the monster he actually was, and I wanted other families who might be living through their own versions of this nightmare to see that it is possible to uncover the truth, even when it has been buried for decades. Rebecca spent 3 weeks investigating. She interviewed Emma for hours over multiple sessions with Emma's therapist present. She interviewed Detective Reeves and reviewed police reports. She examined the financial records I had compiled. She drove to Pine Ridge and interviewed people at the grocery store who remembered Robert coming in every Wednesday for 17 years. She found the property manager who had rented him the cabin under a false name. She interviewed Robert's colleagues who confirmed his Wednesday afternoon routine and his obsessive control over Emma's bedroom. She built a case that was airtight and undeniable and devastating. She called me the night before the article was scheduled to run, and she said in a voice thick with emotion that she had been a reporter for 23 years, and she had covered murders and kidnappings and every kind of human cruelty imaginable. But something about this story, about the calculated long-term nature of Robert's deception, about the way he had weaponized everyone's trust and grief, about the fact that you were grieving your living daughter while he maintained this performance of being the grieving father right alongside you, that haunted her in a way she could not quite articulate. Rebecca's article ran on a Sunday morning, front page above the fold, with the headline, "A Father's Secret, a Mother's 17-Year Nightmare, the Girl Imprisoned." While the world grieved, and it was devastating in its detail and its clarity, it included photographs of Emma as a child, and Emma now. It included excerpts from police reports and financial records. It included interviews with everyone involved, and it laid out the entire timeline of deception in a way that made it impossible for anyone to dismiss or minimize what had happened. The article went viral within hours. It was the top story on every news website by Sunday afternoon. It was being shared on social media by the hundreds of thousands. It was trending on multiple platforms. And by Monday morning, I was getting phone calls from every major news network asking for interviews, asking if Emma and I would be willing to tell our story on television, asking if we wanted to do a documentary or a book deal, or any of the opportunities that come with being at the center of a national tragedy that captures public imagination. I said yes to some interviews and no to others. I chose carefully based on which journalists seemed to understand the gravity and complexity of what had happened, which platforms would reach the audience I wanted to reach, which conversations would advance the cause of raising awareness about parental abduction rather than just sensationalizing our pain for ratings. Emma and I did a joint interview with a respected news program 3 weeks after Rebecca's article ran. We sat side by side on a couch in a television studio with bright lights and multiple cameras, and we told our story in our own words to an audience of millions. I watched Emma speak about her 17 years in that cabin with a composure that broke my heart. She was so articulate, so clear, so dignified despite everything she had been through. And I realized she had been preparing for years to tell this story. She had been rehearsing in her mind what she would say if she ever got the chance. And now finally she had that chance, and she was not going to waste it. The public reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. Overwhelming outrage and support for Emma and me, and crushing condemnation of Robert and everyone who had helped him. Dr. Chen lost his medical license and was charged with fraud and conspiracy and falsifying government documents. He eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Officer Morrison was fired from the police force and charged as an accessory to kidnapping. He is currently serving a 12-year sentence and will never work in law enforcement again. Patricia Holloway lost her funeral home, which had been in her family for 3 generations and was charged with conspiracy and fraud. She pleaded guilty and got 10 years with the possibility of parole after 7. All of them tried to claim they had been manipulated by Robert, that they had not understood the full extent of what they were participating in, that they were victims too in some way, but no one believed them, no one had sympathy for them, and I certainly did not. But here is the thing that nobody expected, the twist that even I did not see coming until I was knee-deep in all the investigations and interviews and court proceedings. Robert had life insurance, a substantial policy he had taken out years before Emma's fake death, and because he died of a heart attack and not by suicide or during the commission of a crime, that policy paid out. $1.7 million paid out to me as his surviving spouse, and I stood in my kitchen holding the check and feeling absolutely nothing for about 30 seconds before I started laughing, the kind of laughter that is not really about amusement, but about the absurdity of the universe, because Robert had inadvertently given me the financial resources to completely rebuild my life and Emma's life without any connection to him or his legacy or anything he had built. I used that money strategically and without guilt. First, I hired the best therapists for Emma, specialists in trauma and captivity and reintegration, because while she was physically healthy, she was psychologically damaged in ways that were going to take years to address, and I was going to make sure she got every resource she needed. Second, I sold the house in Millbrook, the house where Robert and I had lived our false life, the house where Emma had lived for the first 9 years before her imprisonment, because neither of us could stand to be in that space anymore. It was contaminated by lies, and I wanted to start fresh somewhere no one knew our story. Third, I used a significant portion of the money to establish a foundation for families affected by parental abduction, because I had learned during this process that what happened to Emma was rare in its specifics, but that parental abduction is far more common than most people realize. And I wanted to fund resources and support and advocacy for other families who were living through their own versions of this nightmare. Emma and I moved to a city about 6 hours from Millbrook, a place neither of us had any history with, a place where we could be anonymous if we wanted to be, and we started building a life together from scratch. It was not easy. It is still not easy. We are essentially strangers who share DNA and a profound trauma. We are learning who each other is as adults. We are navigating a relationship that should have had 17 more years of foundation, but that instead has a gap that can never be fully bridged. Emma is 26, but in many ways she is still 9. She missed so much of normal development, so many milestones, so many experiences that shape a person, and she is having to figure out who she is and what she wants in a world that is overwhelming and overstimulating and completely different from the isolated cabin she lived in for more than half her life. We do therapy together. We do therapy separately. We have good days and terrible days. We fight and we reconcile, and we are slowly, painfully, building something that might eventually look like a mother-daughter relationship if we are patient and gentle with each other and willing to do the work. I wake up now, and my first thought is not grief anymore. It is gratitude that Emma is alive, followed immediately by rage at what was stolen from us, followed by determination to make sure the rest of our lives are as full and rich and free as possible. I spend my days working on the foundation, connecting with other families, advocating for policy changes that would make it harder for someone to fake a child's death, raising awareness about the signs of coercive control and parental abduction. I have conversations that energize me. I am building something meaningful. I am using my pain for purpose, and I am finally living a life that is mine and not a role someone else cast me in. I am surrounded by people who see me, not as a grieving widow or a victim, but as a survivor and an advocate, and a woman who refused to let the worst thing that ever happened to her be the only thing that defined her. As for Robert, he is dead. He cannot explain himself. He cannot defend himself. He cannot manipulate his way out of the consequences of his actions, and his reputation is permanently destroyed. Everyone who thought he was a good man now knows the truth. His name is synonymous with deception and cruelty, and there is a part of me that wishes he was alive so he could face trial and imprisonment and public humiliation. But there is another part of me that is glad he is gone because it means Emma and I can heal without him hovering in the background, without the fear that he might somehow get out or get away with it or hurt us again. He is gone. The people who helped him are in prison, and Emma and I are free, and that is as close to justice as we are going to get in this lifetime. I do not think about Robert anymore unless someone asks, like I am doing now telling you this story. He is irrelevant to my life now. He made his choices, he constructed his lies, he caused immeasurable harm, and he died before facing any earthly consequences for his actions. But his legacy is destroyed, and his victims are surviving, and that has to be enough. I am busy living my life finally, for the first time in decades, and I am teaching Emma how to live hers, and we are doing it together without him, and without anyone who participated in his crimes, and without the weight of the lies we were forced to live under for so long. What I need you to understand, what I need every woman watching this to really hear and internalize, is that your instincts are telling you the truth. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. If someone's story does not quite add up, there is probably a reason. If you have this nagging sense that you are being lied to or manipulated or gaslit, you are probably right. I ignored my instincts for years. I shoved down the small voice that told me something about Robert's behavior with Emma was off. I convinced myself that my discomfort was irrational, or that I was being paranoid, or that I should be grateful instead of suspicious. And that choice to ignore my instincts cost me and Emma 17 years of our lives together. Do not make the same mistake. Trust yourself more than you trust anyone else. Question things that do not make sense. Demand answers when you are being stonewalled. Do not accept explanations that feel incomplete or convenient. Do not prioritize being polite or agreeable over protecting yourself and the people you love. You are not crazy for questioning things. You are not paranoid for wanting proof. You are not dramatic for insisting on transparency. You are smart, and you are protective, and you are honoring the intuition that evolution gave you specifically to keep you safe from predators. And some predators look like loving husbands and devoted fathers and pillar of the community members. Some monsters are very good at wearing human masks, and the only way to see through those masks is to trust the part of you that can feel when something is wrong, even if you cannot articulate exactly what or why. I am not special for surviving this. I am just a woman who finally started trusting herself, who finally started asking questions, who finally started demanding truth. And look what I found. I found my daughter. I found justice. I found myself. And if I can do that after 17 years of being lost in a fog of manufactured grief, you can do it too. You can trust yourself. You can ask the hard questions. You can demand the truth. You can refuse to accept less than complete honesty from the people in your life. You can protect yourself and your children and your sanity by listening to that small voice inside that knows, that always knows, when something is not right. It is not too late for you no matter how long you have been ignoring your instincts, no matter how deep in the fog you are, no matter how convinced you have become that you are the problem, or that you are imagining things, or that you should just be grateful for what you have. It is not too late to start questioning, to start investigating, to start protecting yourself. I was 53 years old when I finally broke out of the prison of my own denial and discovered the truth. And yes, I wish I had done it 17 years earlier. I wish I had trusted myself when Emma was still 9, and I had that uneasy feeling about their trips. But I cannot change the past, and neither can you. We can only change what we do right now in this moment with the information and clarity we have now. So start now. Trust yourself now. Ask questions now. Demand answers now. Do not wait for permission or for the perfect moment or for undeniable proof, because sometimes the proof only comes after you decide to trust yourself enough to go looking for it. I am not special. I am not extraordinary. I am not some exception. I am just a woman who decided that living with uncertainty and questions was worse than taking the risk of finding out the truth, even if that truth destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. And if I can do that, if I can go from a fog-bound grieving widow who was essentially sleepwalking through her existence to a clear-eyed survivor who dismantled a 17-year conspiracy and got justice for her daughter, so can you. The only difference between me and you right now is that I already started. But you can start today, right now, this moment. The truth you deserve, the life you deserve, the safety and clarity you deserve, all of it is waiting for you on the other side of the fear of trusting yourself more than you trust the people who might be lying to you. If watching karma work through me gave you even a fraction of the relief and validation that it gave me to actually see justice served, To watch the people who destroyed 17 years of my life and Emma's life face real consequences. To know that their crimes were exposed and punished and that their reputations were permanently destroyed, hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more women who desperately need to hear it. Women who are ignoring their instincts right now. Women who are being told they are crazy or paranoid when they know something is wrong. Women who need permission to trust themselves and ask questions and demand truth. Like this video right now, because stories of women who trusted their instincts and found the truth need to be seen by everyone, especially by other mothers who have that nagging feeling that something is not right with their children or their families. Like it now. If this story moved you, shook you, made you think about your own life and the things you might be ignoring or accepting that you should be questioning, I need you to do 3 things right now before you click away. First, like this video. I am serious. Hit that thumbs up right now so the algorithm shows this to more women who need to see it. Women who are in the fog right now. Women who need to know their instincts are valid and they have the power to uncover truth no matter how deeply it is buried. Your like literally saves lives by making this discoverable. Second, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications. And I mean all notifications, not just some, because next week I am sharing the story of a 48-year-old woman who discovered her supposedly dead son was actually alive and had been living under a fake identity created by her ex-husband as part of a custody dispute that went to extremes no one could have predicted. And what she did when she found him will make my story look simple by comparison. It involves international law, private investigators, and a court battle that set new precedents for parental abduction cases. You will not want to miss it. And third, most important, comment below and tell me, what is that nagging feeling you have been ignoring? What is the thing that does not quite add up? What is the question you have been afraid to ask because you are worried about the answer or about seeming paranoid or dramatic? Because your instincts matter, your questions matter, your need for truth matters. And this community is here to remind you that you are not crazy, you are not paranoid, you are perceptive, and perception is a gift that can save your life or the life of someone you love if you are brave enough to trust it. Share your nagging feeling in the comments right now. I read every single one, and so do thousands of other women who come here looking for validation and permission to trust themselves. Do all 3 things now, and I will see you next week with another story of a woman who refused to accept the lies she was told and fought her way to the truth. Thank you for trusting me with your time and your heart today. Now go trust yourself.